Ghost in the Gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room, as usual. Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloodied child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, "Please, I want to help you." To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain." The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. The Ghostly Tome. An old library stood at the edge of town, a structure with stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. Ivy covered the walls, and narrow arched windows allowed only the faintest. This was where Clara worked as the head librarian, a job she had cherished for over a decade. She always found solace in the silence, the smell of old books. But something had changed. Clara arrived early and approached the heavy wooden door. As she unlocked it, a shiver came over her, a feeling she had been experiencing more often lately. She took it as the cold of the morning and went inside. The library was still and silent, as usual at this hour. Clara moved through the familiar aisles, her footsteps echoing softly. She followed her routine, checking book returns and organizing new arrivals. The building's silence was comforting, yet today it felt oppressive, almost watchful. She made her way to the basement, where the rare and old books were stored. It was her favorite part of the library, but for some reason, they were often not taken out for reading. The basement was the coldest part of the library, and as Clara descended the creaky wooden stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, and the musty smell of old paper was stronger here. She was searching for a book that a researcher had requested from her library. As she searched, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She quickly turned around, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just a rat. Clara continued her search. Finally, she found the book she was looking for, an old leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering. As she pulled it from the shelf, she felt a sudden, icy breeze brush past her. The lights flickered, and she heard the rustling again, louder this time, as if something was moving through the stacks. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. She decided it was time to leave the basement. As she turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, darker than the others, passed between the bookshelves. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow that had the vague shape of a human being. The shadow stopped, forming a vaguely human-like shape that seemed to be looking straight at her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. She stumbled up the stairs, nearly dropping the book in her haste. Panic struck. Clara struggled to find the flashlight, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't turn it on. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, until she felt it right next to her. Clara felt something cold and wet touch her arm, and she screamed. At that moment, she dropped the book, revealing pages filled with strange, unfamiliar symbols. Reluctantly took the book back, feeling an inexplicable pull to take it with me. In the darkness, as she brought the book upstairs, Clara could feel its presence. It seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with fear. As she neared the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening noise. The library above seemed unchanged, still and silent, but the claustrophobic feeling remained. Back in the main lobby, Clara sat at her desk, a mysterious book in front of her. She placed the book on the table and took a breath, then stared at it with both fear and curiosity. She started to wonder whether she should open it or not, but then she curiously opened it to examine the symbols, flipping through each page, brittle with age. The symbols seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. She shook her head, blaming her imagination. And thinking she was being paranoid. Darkness filled the library. She suddenly read a passage out loud. Suddenly, the whispering became louder. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Clara's breathing became rapid. She tried to ignore it, closed the book immediately, and decided to put it back in its place. The library was silent and dark. Clara, she doesn't know if she's in her imagination, or if something is residing in this library, or if there are hidden secrets that she doesn't know yet. Morning light cast long shadows through narrow windows. Clara stood outside, hesitating to enter. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Clara slowly walked toward her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she passed by, she glimpsed the old book she had stored in the basement yesterday lying on her desk. Clara was horrified. She was certain she'd put it back on the shelf in the basement. Clara stared at the book, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it, deciding to destroy it in hopes of freeing herself from this fear. She walked toward the old fireplace at the far end of the library, gripping the book tightly. She opened it, and the symbols writhed as if alive, almost resisting her. She threw the book into the flames. A hissing sound escaped from the book. The fire abruptly went out, extinguished, leaving the book charred but still intact. Clara stared at the ancient book, desperate. She raised the book to throw it into the trash. But as she swung her arm, an invisible force pulled it from her hand. The book flew across the room, hovering mid-air. Then it started flying back, hurtling toward her with fierce speed. It slammed into her chest, knocking the wind out of her in pain. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her aching ribs. She held her breath, watching the book fall to the floor, its pages flapping wildly. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the book again, and from the corner of her eye, she sensed someone standing and watching her. At that moment, everything seemed to go dark. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure from her nightmares. She lifted her phone flashlight to see. The figure moved slowly into the faint light, revealing the distorted, grotesque shape of a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. Her face was gaunt, with only skeletal features. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, revealing jagged, decayed teeth. Her eyes were black, hollow, and lifeless. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The grotesque woman moved closer, her jerky movements almost puppet-like. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged toward her, its twisted, skeletal hand stretching out, distorting as it reached for her. Its claw-like fingers scratched across Clara's face, as if devouring a meal. Clara raised the book defensively, trying to fend it off, but the spirit lunged at her again. With its unnaturally elongated arm, it grabbed her shoulder once again, pulling her closer. Pain tore through her, as if her skin was being ripped apart. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The woman's face came closer, her distorted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing layers of rotting flesh inside her mouth. She stared into the ghost's endless, empty black eyes. The book slipped from her hand. The book's pages began to flip wildly, symbols blazing with dark energy, as if absorbing the terror flooding the room. In a final attempt to escape, Clara crawled backward, away from it, but it floated after her, laughing loudly, piercingly. Clara's vision dimmed as her strength drained away, her body paralyzed, her mind succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The library stood eerily silent, pale light cast on the dark stone walls. Villagers gathered, whispering to each other as they noticed Clara's absence. The library doors remained shut, and though a few dared to peer through the windows, they saw only empty, silent rooms with no sign of Clara. The whispers lingered, awaiting the next unfortunate soul to uncover the library's secrets. Abandoned house invaded. Behind my house, there is a large but old and decaying building. It no longer resembles a home. It now looks more like an abandoned house. It has been vacant for decades, or so my parents said. But every time I passed by, I would unmistakably hear the sound of electricity crackling from inside. It made no sense. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, one day I decided to investigate. I asked my friend Tim to come with me after school. He agreed, though we both felt a tense, underlying dread as we stood in front of the house, a bad premonition hanging in the air. As soon as we pushed the door open, it creaked on its rusty hinges, filling the silence. Inside, the air was thick with an unbearable stench, a mix of mold and rot. Scattered across the floor were piles of old dog food, and the foul odor hit us in waves. We carefully stepped through the strange debris and noticed something odd. The floor was littered with nails, hundreds of them, along with animal traps, as if someone had deliberately tried to prevent people from walking through the house. We tiptoed through, avoiding the nails, our curiosity growing stronger with each step. Then we heard the sound of an electric charge, followed by a scream of pain from upstairs. It sent a shiver down my spine. We should have turned back, but our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to climb the stairs. On the second floor, the noise led us to a closed door. From behind it, we heard a man's voice muttering something strange, as if giving commands. What was happening on the other side? Summoning our last bit of courage, we tiptoed up the stairs and peeked inside. The sight was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. It looked like someone had been chained up. Two people sat on the floor, appearing to be a couple who had been captured and imprisoned. Their eyes were wide open, filled with terror. A man stood before them, holding a stun gun, threatening them to follow his commands. For a moment, the room fell silent as the two people stared at us in disbelief. Their eyes pleaded for help, silently begging for mercy. Then their voices broke with desperation, sobbing and pleading not to be harmed. The man panicked, shouting at them to be quiet while violently beating them with the stun gun. But they continued screaming, their cries echoing through every corner of the room. Tim froze, paralyzed with fear, and accidentally knocked over a piece of wood, creating a loud noise. That was when the man noticed us. The man turned toward us, his eyes filled with rage. Without hesitation, he grabbed the stun gun and charged at us. We bolted down the stairs, but Tim wasn't fast enough. His screams echoed down the hallway as I heard the crackling of the stun gun. I didn't stop running until I was outside, my heart pounding in my chest. I called the police, barely able to get the words out. But I knew I couldn't leave Tim behind. I ran back into the house, trying to stay as quiet as possible, recalling the self-defense lessons I had learned at school. The door to the room was still open, and I peeked in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The man was putting a collar around Tim's neck, his hands already bound tightly. I couldn't just stand there and watch my friend and these innocent people suffer like this. Rage surged through me, and I charged at the man, kicking him with all the strength I had. He staggered and fell, dropping the stun gun. I grabbed it, threatening him. Moments later, the police arrived and pulled me away from him. As the police began to untie the captives, they discovered something even more horrifying. Their feet had been glued to the floor with industrial adhesive. I was horrified that the man had gone to such lengths. Finally, the rescue team arrived, and the hostages were freed, though their condition was dire. They had been beaten, starved, and fed animal food. When the police interrogated the man, his chilling response was that he wanted to keep humans as pets. In the end, he was arrested and taken to prison. None of us ever spoke about that day again. This is a warning from what I witnessed. If you ever come across an abandoned house, no matter how strong your urge to explore, resist it. Stay away, because no one can guarantee you will make it out alive. Vengeance of the Soul. It was Saturday night, and Hannah was still at her university library, finishing a project due next week. Her friend had ditched her again, leaving her to finish it all on her own. She checked the clock and saw it was nearly 10 p.m., so she closed her textbooks and returned them to the shelf. Hannah went back to the table and put her books in her bag, and at that moment, she heard a noise. She looked around and thought she saw a man staring at her, but when she blinked, he was gone. Hannah left and headed home. She knew she shouldn't wander alone in a new city. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned around, seeing a figure in a dark hoodie disappearing into an alleyway. She stopped, feeling a surge of fear. Was someone following her? She hurried on, relieved that her apartment was nearby. Hannah got into her building safely. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 14th floor. Just as the doors were closing, someone reached in to stop them. She held her breath as the doors opened, and a tall, fairly handsome man stepped into the elevator, his dark eyes looking at her with a warm expression. He started a friendly conversation, complimenting her outfit. She blushed, feeling a bit nervous. The elevator stopped on the 13th floor, and he stepped out, looking back at her and saying, "See you around." But as the doors started to close, Hannah saw him reach into his coat and pull out a shiny knife. Realizing the danger, she pulled out her phone as the elevator reached her floor. But just as she dialed the last digit for the police, the doors opened again. She screamed as she saw the man standing at the door, with nowhere left to run. He plunged the knife into her chest, her sweater soaking with blood. Pain spread across her chest as everything faded to black. The next morning, neighbors found Hannah dead in the elevator. Residents raised concerns about safety measures. Security cameras were installed, and more importantly, an emergency stop button was added to the elevator. Months passed, and the elevator killer remained uncaught. He prided himself on getting away with the perfect murder and wondered if he could pull it off again in the same building. He chose another Saturday night and saw a woman waiting to enter the elevator. He stood behind her, ensuring the guard was still distracted by his game on his phone. He pulled his hoodie tighter over his head as he noticed the camera. The doors opened, and the woman stepped inside. Just like before, she pressed 14, and he said he lived on the 13th floor as he pressed the button. But the woman didn't respond. She seemed strange, her head bowed, her hair covering most of her face. She wore a white dress and was barefoot, which he found odd, but her appearance didn't concern him. He kept a knife in his pocket, eager to use it. The 13th floor arrived, and he began to step out. He was ready to repeat what he'd done before, but as he turned back, he realized she was no longer in the elevator. Confusion crossed his face. He was certain she'd been there, but now the elevator was empty. He went in to check. The elevator door suddenly closed, and the overhead lights crunched and dimmed. He heard a hiss. The man felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as a chill ran down his spine. The guy looked up, and his eyes widened. The woman was crawling on the ceiling, her hair growing long and slithering like a snake. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her smiling mouth revealed many sharp teeth. He noticed a blood stain on her sweater and realized she was Hannah, the woman he had murdered. Hannah's spirit reached out, grabbing his neck, savoring his terror. Then Hannah pulled him into her bloody mouth, her razor-sharp teeth waiting for him. His screams echoed within the metallic confines of the elevator, but no one heard. The killer became nothing more than a memory, consumed by the very spirit he had created. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear, echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, the boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again.
Horror story of school locker. Sure, here is the translation of your text into English. A few days ago, Anna attended a party. The police showed up, and everyone scattered. Anna took a shortcut, fell into the river, and has been missing since. When they found her, she was no longer alive. She had passed away. The principal asked Kat to clean out Anna's locker. It had been a week since the funeral, and A&A's. Mother still hadn't come to collect her belongings. Kat nodded, feeling both curious and fearful. Anna had been one of the popular girls, always surrounded by friends. The news of her sudden death had shocked everyone. She wasn't like that. I was quite shy and had almost no friends. She approached the locker, its dull gray door a stark contrast to the vibrant memories of its owner. She twisted the combination lock, and with a metallic click, it opened. Inside, the locker was neatly organized. It only took her a few minutes to scoop Anna's belongings into her backpack. There were just a few textbooks, a small makeup pouch, and a neatly folded scarf remaining. As she reached in to gather the items, a strange gust of wind brushed against the back of her neck, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, but the hallway was empty. She picked up the scarf, its silk smooth and cool. She remembered that Anna always wore this scarf like a treasured possession. It seemed that she really loved it. Suddenly, a whisper echoed in the confined space, telling her that the scarf was beautiful and would suit her perfectly. Her heart pounded. Perhaps she had imagined it. She continued cleaning the locker, but the unease lingered. As she closed the door, the whisper came again, more insistent this time, telling her,
"Wear it always, and everyone will admire you."
How could she refuse? Even as goosebumps rose on her skin, she nodded and tied the scarf around her neck. Although it was silk, it felt heavy, pressing down on her bones. Kat looked up at the mirror and almost screamed. She didn't just look like Anna in that moment. She was Anna. The scarf somehow warped her skin, transforming her face. She pulled with all her strength, but it wouldn't come off. Her elbow struck the mirror, causing it to bleed. Then a voice whispered,
"It's okay,"
and assured her that everyone would love her. She decided to take a chance and see if it was true. Days passed, and she began to notice changes. People who had never acknowledged her before started to smile and greet her. The popular crowd invited her to sit with them at lunch. Kat enjoyed the attention she was receiving. She attributed the change to her makeover and the confidence boost from wearing Anna's scarf. so she didn't believe it too much. But the whispers started again and wouldn't stop. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Anna's reflection staring back at her, smiling that familiar, haunting smile. It was as if Anna was still there, watching, waiting. Day by day, the whispers grew into screams in her head. Panic set in. She stumbled, knocking over her bedside lamp. As she went to school, she always avoided that locker because she felt a dark presence looming around Anna's locker. Kat's breath caught in her throat as she tried to pull the scarf off, but it tightened, choking her. Then a voice echoed in her head, asking what she was doing. The next day, she decided to return the scarf to Anna's locker, hoping to break the curse. When she approached the locker, the hallway was eerily silent. She unlocked it and placed the scarf inside. Before she could close the door, the scarf flew up and wrapped around her neck again. She fell to the floor, the scarf tightening more and more. Her vision darkened, and the last thing she saw was her own reflection in the locker mirror, her face now twisted into a smile that wasn't hers. A few days later, students whispered about Kat's disappearance. Her locker remained shut, and the smell of decay began to permeate the hallway. The principal and the janitor tried to open it, but the new lock seemed fused shut. Only Kat had the combination. One evening, as the janitor was mopping the empty hallway, he heard a faint whisper.
Wear it, and everyone will admire you.
The janitor glanced around, but saw nothing. He shook his head, thinking it was his imagination. But as he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby window. He saw Kat's face staring back at him, a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, smiling that haunting, familiar smile. The janitor gradually turned pale and was so frightened that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He ran out of there as fast as he could and immediately went to the police station to report what he had just witnessed. At first, he thought it was just an illusion, but when he linked it with Anna's departure and Kat's disappearance, it was really a coincidence, as if there was some kind of curse. Sometime later, the police came and took the cabinet out of the school. The mystery of Kat's disappearance and the scarf remains a mystery that no one wants to talk about. The curse of the top students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, a page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware, your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Elena ran across the school grounds, she felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. "Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next." She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.
The crazy mother on campus. Exam season had arrived, and normally our school library would close. But because of the exams, the school decided to keep it open until midnight. My house is not far from the school, so instead of studying at home, I prefer to study in the quiet and peaceful library. That day, I left home at 6 o'clock, engrossed in my studies, and didn't realize that it was already 10 p.m. I had never stayed this late before. The ticking clock was loud, each second echoing in the emptiness, signaling that it was nearly midnight. Strangely, there were hardly any students studying at that hour. It was absolute silence. I finished my work and headed home. The library is at the end of the hallway, so as usual, I walked down the long, dark corridor of the school. But today, I felt an unusual chill in the air. It was empty and the silence was suffocating. I walked through the hallway and quickly approached the exit. I walked fast, the sound of my footsteps echoing ominously. The once familiar campus now felt strange and frightening. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The path narrowed as I entered the school garden, the lights becoming fewer. A sudden loud snap of a branch made me stop dead in my tracks. I spun around, heart racing, but saw only shadows. Exhausted and hungry, I could barely walk properly. I kept my eyes on the ground as I walked. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a woman walking with a strange, crippled gait. Her legs seemed twisted, making it difficult for her to walk. She moved like a zombie. Now I was close enough to see her clearly. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her hair hanging in tangled clumps around her ghostly pale face. My heart pounded in my chest as the woman limped toward me, her eyes staring as if she wanted to pounce on me. I backed away, fear enveloping me. The uneven footsteps of the woman grew louder, echoing in the empty night. She pursued me relentlessly. I ran aimlessly until I reached the school parking lot, desperately searching for a place to hide. The parking lot was eerily empty. I hid behind a car, my breath coming in ragged gasps from the exhausting chase. But she did not tire. She searched for me with a crazed determination. From my hiding spot, I saw the woman moving past the cars, her head turning from side to side, searching. I felt truly terrified and breathless. The woman stopped near my hiding place. I held my breath, afraid to make a sound, and prayed she wouldn't see me. Thankfully, she just stood there, scouting the area, and then turned and continued moving. Seizing the opportunity, I bolted from my hiding spot, running towards the dormitory. The lights of the building were a beacon of hope, but the woman's footsteps grew louder behind me. I didn't care about anything else. I just ran, fearing for my life. I reached the dormitory entrance, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keypad. I could hear the woman's labored breathing right behind me. Finally, the door clicked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. I looked through the glass, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. The campus was dark and silent. I collapsed onto my bed, my mind racing with the terror of what had just happened. The image of the woman's pale, haunting face was etched into my memory. The next morning, I was determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I asked the groundskeeper who tended to the school's garden. He looked quite old, so I thought he might know something. I asked him, and he said that in 1998, there was a 32-year-old woman who had a 20-year-old daughter who also attended this school. One day, while playing with her friends, the daughter mysteriously had an accident on the school grounds and died. The mother couldn't bear the thought that her daughter might have been bullied or something terrible had happened to her that she didn't know about. Losing her daughter drove her mad, and she would appear and disappear erratically. I decided I would never walk alone on the school grounds again. For the sake of my safety, the danger was too real and could strike at any moment. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck. and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over. Killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. but he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and I called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet, but they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared. My hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles, just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form of a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle, almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me. His face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. Rain pounded against the windshield as I drove down a deserted highway, my headlights barely piercing through the torrential downpour. I was a solitary traveler, accustomed to nights like this, navigating strange roads in search of new experiences. As I saw a sign emerge from the darkness, "Welcome to Cottage City," a wave of relief washed over me. Shelter was near. I pressed on, hoping the town would offer some respite from the storm. I drove slowly through the quiet streets. The town felt almost frozen in time. One house caught my eye, a crumbling structure by the roadside, abandoned and eerie. The walls were spray, painted with words like "Keep Out, Demon," and "Don't Look Back." Wooden crosses were haphazardly nailed to the porch and gate, as if someone was trying to ward off something within. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over and stepped out into the rain, turning on my flashlight. I stood outside, the light catching the faded words, and when I shone the beam toward the house, I froze. In the upstairs window, a boy stood staring down at me. His face was pale, with dark circles under his red, swollen eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't move, just gazed at me with an empty stare. I shivered and called out, "Hey, are you here alone, boy? Do you need help?" I mentioned that I was looking for a place to stay. The boy tilted his head, his expression unchanged, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me, questioning why I was there and suggesting I shouldn't be in this place. He began to speak. "Are you here to meet her?" It was an odd question, one that filled me with dread. I thought this place was abandoned. I asked why he was here alone and where she was. Then, inexplicably, he broke into a strange smile and told me, "Her? She's waiting for a replacement." His gaze shifted to something behind me, his expression turning to one of horror. A strong wind blew through, rattling the doors of the old house. Then suddenly, a hand touched me from behind. I turned around to see a creepy old man standing behind me with a lantern, his bewildered face wondering why I was standing in front of this abandoned house. I stammered, explaining that I was just a traveler, seeking shelter from the storm. I told him about the boy I had seen in the window, but he insisted that I must have imagined it, even though I knew what I had seen. I learned that the nearest hotel was still an hour's drive away, and he told me that if I wanted, I could stay overnight at his house. He made me feel strange, yet I accepted his invitation. It was hard to fathom that the boy I had seen in the abandoned house was just my imagination. But something told me this man knew more than he let on. The old man's house looked as ancient as its exterior. The furniture was old, the walls covered with dusty bookshelves and faded photographs. He led me to a seat by the fireplace. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask him about the house. He told me that many years ago, he moved here with his father. There weren't many children in the neighborhood, so he quickly made friends with a boy named Roland. Roland's family was large and boisterous, always filled with laughter. Roland's aunt, a warm woman, always had candy for the children, especially for him. But one day, she passed away suddenly. The whole family was grief-stricken, everyone except Roland. He didn't shed a single tear, didn't say a word. He just stood at her funeral, frozen and silent, his eyes vacant even as they lowered her into the ground. He had changed since that day, hardly going outside and spending hours alone in his room. Ronald was always in his room with his Ouija board. He used to say his aunt had taught him to use it, and Ronald would sit for hours trying to communicate with her. As he continued his story, I could almost visualize the events unfolding. Something had shifted in him that day, something dark and frightening. Then he continued telling me about what the boy had gone through since that day. Right after his aunt passed away, frightening things started happening in that house. At midnight, Roland's mother began hearing strange noises coming from his room at night, scratching sounds, like fingernails scraping the walls. Roland lay awake, eyes wide open, staring at something in the darkness. He felt a presence, something lurking beside his bed, watching him. Henry leaned forward. He told me how Roland had confided in his older friend, saying he felt eyes watching him every night as it stood at the edge of his bed, silent but terrifying. The next morning, Roland's mother checked his bed and found scratch marks on the mattress. And more than that, his mother found them on Roland's own skin. Roland would scream, sometimes laugh loudly in the middle of the night. His voice changed, becoming rough, distorted, and pained. Roland's mother would rush in, only to find him alone, trembling, his eyes filled with fear. He told her about them, strange, shadowy figures. They all gathered around his bed, staring with their hollow mouths open in a silent scream. They all thought Roland was different. Everyone knew something was invading him, but no one could stop it or help him. I shuddered as the old man recounted the family's desperate decision to call for an exorcism. Roland's family called in priests to perform an exorcism. Father Raymond was among them, placing a cross under Roland's pillow, hoping to drive out whatever haunted the house. The ritual began, Latin whispers filling the room. The exorcism became chaotic. Roland writhed on the bed, growling like an animal as if the cross caused him unbearable pain. Furniture flew across the room, and the cross seemed to burn him, driving him into a violent rage. Latin phrases poured from his mouth, mixed with a raspy laugh. His body twisted in unnatural ways, his eyes staring at something invisible. Father Raymond performed many exorcisms on Roland, and he endured immense pain. During the exorcisms, he would roll and vomit, spit, speak in Latin, then laugh uncontrollably. His voice was like a demon from the depths. Once, during an exorcism, Roland suddenly broke free from the priest's grip and lunged at the metal bed frame. He swung it wildly, striking a priest's arm, forcing them to halt the exorcism. On the night of the final exorcism, words appeared on Roland's body as if someone invisible was carving them with a sharp knife. On the final night, 3 priests performed Roland's last exorcism, even witnessing his body levitating. When they recited the final incantation, Roland's body fell motionless onto the bed. Everyone believed he was cured. Roland's family moved away soon after, and no one ever saw him again. Neighbors avoided the house, cursing it. Some families even moved away due to strange occurrences. He told me that some believe Roland's spirit never left, that he's still trapped in that house. I shuddered, recalling the boy in the window grinning at me, his eyes dark and hollow. I told the old man what I'd seen. Hesitating, as I said the boy looked no older than 14. The old man nodded slowly, saying that was Roland's exact age when he vanished. I was stunned by what I'd heard. The old man pointed to a small room under the stairs, suggesting I sleep there. He warned me again to stay away from the exorcised house, then went upstairs. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of the boy from my mind. I wondered what would have happened if he hadn't come. Could I have been the next, just as the boy had said? The sun finally rose, and the memory of the night clung to me like a shadow. I thanked Henry and left, but the questions remained. Did Roland die during the exorcism, his soul trapped forever, or had something darker consumed him? But one thing was certain, I would never return to Cottage City again. Ghosts at the theater. Jane was a beautiful woman. She often filmed famous or mysterious locations with her crew, doing whatever it took to gain fame. Today, Jane was standing in the bathroom of the Birdcage Theater, also known as the Birdcage Theater in Arizona, which was now out of operation. Surrounded by whispers about the past, she looked in the mirror and applied lipstick with excitement welling up inside her. Hundreds of thousands of followers are waiting for her latest video, and she plans to take them on a dramatic journey about the haunted history of this famous theater. It is famous for its cruel history of violence and death. As she leaned closer to the mirror, something blurred at the edge of her vision. An indistinct shape hovered behind her. Startled, she screamed and quickly turned back to look. That surprise was from her boyfriend, Ken. He responded with an amused and teasing attitude. She started complaining about him scaring her. But after the laughter and teasing, she still felt something truly behind her, making her think about the curses that haunted this place. Ken set up the phone, urging her to start recording, and Jane was ready to begin. Through her journeys exploring haunted houses and places, she had built an online persona as someone who delved into the paranormal. Sharing such stories made her following grow continuously, Her sixth sense leads her to supernatural encounters. She begins to tell the dark, mysterious stories behind this birdcage theater. She started passing places like bars and old tables that made her feel a dark energy around her. Jane shivered and continued, recounting stories of gunfights and dreams. Broken ended life here. Suddenly, the piano in the corner played a faint, haunting melody. It was only a few notes, but they seemed to echo endlessly. Jane kept her camera steady, moving toward the staircase. As she climbed the stairs, she suddenly felt like she heard the mournful cry of someone, seemingly a woman. She carefully looked around. There was no one else, or any changes. She started to turn to ask Ken, but it seemed like no one heard that except me. Finally, she reached the theater's dressing room. The room was dark, with faded, peeling wallpaper at the corners. Jane felt a sharp, terrible pain in her heart as she stepped inside. She started sitting against the wall, trying to breathe. Ken worriedly told her to stop, but she was stubborn and determined to have footage at this place. Jane begins to recall the tragic gossip story of Margarita, a dancer and aspiring actress. She is in her prime. She was murdered by her own colleague in this very room. She was stabbed through the heart with a high heel by someone envious of her success. It was said that her spirit haunted the room, seeking revenge or even a way to live again. Despite the lingering pain, Jane was intrigued. She was a bit scared, but couldn't ignore Margarita's ghost story. It would complete her video perfectly. She returned to the bathroom to prepare. When she stood in front of the mirror, something was different. Jane leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. That's when she actually saw something. A ghostly figure stood behind me, his face pale and painted, his eyes sunken and dark. She wore an old dress, her expression a distorted mixture of longing and anger. I feel like maybe it's Margarita. She quickly raised her phone to record a video. The pain returned, piercing her chest like a blade, but Jane persisted in capturing her reflection on the glass. After a while, Ken didn't see Jane anywhere. Worried, he went to check near the restroom. The door was wide open, and he saw Jane acting very strangely. He was shocked to see Jane standing in front of the mirror, talking to herself, and he asked if she was okay. She slowly turned to look at Ken from head to toe and said, "Who are you?" Her words sounded strange, foreign. Her eyes widened in confusion. He chuckled awkwardly, thinking I was pulling one of my usual dark jokes. Clearly, there was some truth being overlooked. Ken led that girl out of the theater, unaware that his real girlfriend was trapped in the mirror, freeing a vengeful spirit. Jane was bound to this place with no escape. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. Unheard, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. She was trapped. Perhaps she had been possessed when Jane started filming Margarita. Margarita had stolen Jane's life and identity, and now she was out in the world, free to pursue the fame that had been taken from her long ago. In the days that followed, Jane's social media was filled with increasingly strange and terrifying posts. Her followers loved the change, but no one knew they weren't following Jane, they were following Margarita, who was dead and now replacing Jane. Whispers behind the door. It's been 9 years since that happened, but I still remember it clearly. In the middle of the city, I rented a small apartment in an old, damp-smelling building. With my job as a waiter, it was all I could afford, just enough to get by. Not long after, something strange began to happen. It started with small noises, almost unnoticeable at first. A faint voice, muttering in the middle of the night. I remember waking up that first night, the sound barely audible, like someone whispering on the other side of the wall. The walls weren't well insulated, so I could hear it. At first, I thought it was a dream. The voice was too distant to make out clearly. But soon, the words became clearer, sharper. Go die. The words echoed in the dark, sending chills down my spine. I sat up, every hair on my neck standing on end. Who would say such a thing? My eyes darted toward the door. I got out of bed, quietly stepping toward the peephole. Slowly, I saw a thin man, shirtless, his face twisted into a wide, terrifying smile. His hand scratched slowly at the door with a single finger, the gentle sound of it sending chills through me. He just stood there, scratching the door and whispering. From that day on, the man became a frequent, unwelcome visitor. Every 2 or 3 nights, he would return, scratching at my door, mumbling, and sometimes singing in a shrill, childlike voice. The sound was terrifying, like a nightmarish lullaby. Every time I looked through the peephole, there he was, whispering threats. I thought about confronting him, flinging the door open, and demanding he stop. But I couldn't see his hands, they were out of view, and I feared he might be holding something dangerous. The mumbling stopped. Everything was silent. I leaned forward, cautiously pressing my ear against the door. Then a loud knock startled me, sending me falling backward. He said,
I know you're there. Be careful.
But in the daytime, it was as if nothing had happened between us. I'd run into him in the hallway, and he would smile politely, nod, and walk away. I even asked him once why he kept coming to my door at night. He seemed surprised, then confused, denying any knowledge of what I was talking about. One night, I was about to sleep, but I had to grab something from the living room. The mumbling started again, but this time, it felt much closer. I crept toward the bedroom door, checking to make sure it was locked. Thank God it was. But the doorknob turned slowly, rattling as if he was testing it. Then silence for a long while. I didn't know how he had gotten in. I was terrified, but after the silence lasted long enough, I decided to go out and check. I stepped outside. From the corner near the door, I saw my thin neighbor banging his head against the wall, singing something I couldn't understand. I was truly frightened. I tried to talk to him, but he only turned and threatened me. I stumbled back, startled, but he wasn't hurt. He just kept grinning and eventually walked out of the apartment by himself. I decided I had had enough and finally called the police. They took him to a psychiatric ward. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had escaped from a mental hospital 2 months earlier. Apparently, he had a violent history. In fact, he had been admitted after attacking a mailman with a shovel and had snuck out undetected. Now I live in another city, far from that building, far from the memories of those nights. But sometimes, I still can't sleep well, unable to shake the feeling that he might come back. Horror story, The Strange Man with Red Eyes. This happened 6 years ago when I was working the night shift as a security guard in an old office building. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again. That night, the pale moonlight cast an eerie glow over the deserted scene, creating a chilling atmosphere. Around 3 a.m., I was doing my final patrol before ending my shift. As I walked through the dark hallway, I heard strange footsteps. I looked around, but saw no one. The footsteps continued, seeming to come closer to me. I started feeling uneasy, trying to stay calm and continue my work. But just as I reached the security room, the door suddenly opened. A man with disheveled hair and bloodshot eyes walked in. He was wearing a long black coat and carrying an old suitcase. There was no one around, and I couldn't understand how he got into the building at this hour. I swallowed nervously, trying to speak to him.
Do you need any help?
I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't answer right away. He just stared at me for a long moment. Then he opened his mouth, his voice raspy like the wind through a crack in the door. I need to go to a very special place, a place you will never forget. I didn't understand his meaning, but I responded anyway.
I can't leave the building during my shift. Can you specify the location?
The man smiled in a strange way, his thin lips curling up. All right, take me to the basement. I was surprised, but didn't want to cause trouble, so I nodded and led him there. We stepped into the elevator, the air inside becoming oppressive. When the elevator doors opened at the basement level, a cold draft swept in. The man stepped out first, and I followed, feeling more anxious. He stopped in front of a small room, its door long locked. I didn't remember ever seeing this room before. The man pulled out an old key from his coat pocket, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. I stood outside, not daring to follow. I've reached my destination, he said from inside. Thank you for guiding me. I turned to leave, but suddenly he appeared right in front of me, as quick as lightning. He placed his hand on my shoulder, gripping so tightly that it hurt. Remember, you have helped me, and I will remember you. I screamed, trying to break free, but I couldn't. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I collapsed. My eyes gradually closed. I gradually saw the door of the room closing before my eyes, accompanied by his satisfied, creepy laughter. And then I fainted. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed. The doctor said I had a heart attack, but was lucky to survive. I recalled the man and asked everyone around about him, but no one had seen him, and the security cameras recorded no one but me. From the video extracted from the camera, it seems that I was talking to myself in front of the hallway door and then collapsed on the floor. It seems that I was taken to the hospital by the neighbors. I was haunted by his final look and his mysterious words. I could never forget that raspy voice. And every time I remember, I feel a chill down my spine. I had once guided a mysterious man, and it had changed my life forever. The mysterious camp. I am a camping enthusiast. On this 2-day trip to the forest near my home, I went camping with my longtime companion Ring, the dog that has been with me for a long time. But I realized I was not as alone as I thought. It was in November. The daytime weather was quite warm, but it was quite cold at night. As always, I brought all the camping gear I had. Since it was close to the lake, I also brought a fishing rod to fish. I arrived and set up camp in a comfortable clearing near the lake to fish. While fishing, Ring kept looking into the forest, and his tail was wagging as if he had discovered something. I thought it was probably some small animals that he saw or heard. Ring is very well trained and will not run off without my command. After about an hour of fishing, we walked around the lake. On the other side of the lake, I saw a few people walking into the forest. They were too far away to be sure, but they really looked like humans. We quickly returned to the camp. When I got back to the camp, I saw the tent zipper was open. Someone had entered my tent, but nothing was missing. Not that there was much to take besides the campfire and fishing gear. But I knew I was right. They were a group of people. The thought of them sneaking into my tent without permission made me quite creepy. To be safe, I spent the next hour moving my camp to a different location further down the lake. Then I started chopping wood to light a fire. When the fire was burning, I fed Ring and then warmed up the food for dinner. Ring continued barking into the forest. By then, it was dark, and I couldn't see anything except the firelight. I looked into the darkness with a sense of fear. With that thought, I brought Ring into the tent and extinguished the fire. I crawled into my sleeping bag, and with the reading light beside me, I was reading my novel. Ring's ears kept twitching as he heard things that I couldn't hear. He kept looking around and started growling. I imagined someone out there in the darkness, scarier than a bear. Eventually, Ring calmed down and put his head down. I felt uneasy and wanted the night to pass quickly, so I turned off the light and went to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of growling and howling. I told Ring to be quiet. I listened and heard someone whistling, the kind of whistle you do to get a dog's attention. Someone was really out there at my camp in the thick darkness, and I was terrified. Then there were footsteps coming closer to the tent until they were right outside and then stopped. Ring howled madly, and I held him tight to keep him quiet without saying anything. There was no crackling fire, just absolute silence except for the wind. Looking towards the tent's zipper, I tried to deepen my voice and commanded and shouted, "You'd better get out of here, don't come any closer," then threatened them with my emergency flare gun. The footsteps moved away from the tent, slow and heavy. I couldn't sleep after that, but I was too scared to leave the tent and pack up in the dark. Then from a distance, the scream of a woman echoed for miles. It sounded like a woman really screaming for her life. That was the last straw. I grabbed my life quickly, put on my shoes, grabbed a flashlight, and ran. I sprinted until I reached my truck. I slept in the truck that night, and at dawn, I went back to the forest with Ring to pack up the camp. I didn't even check to see if my stuff had been rummaged through. I just hurried to get out of there. As soon as I had signal, I called the non-emergency police number I found online to report the scream and the suspicious people around my camp the night before. I don't know what happened after that and don't know what is going on in that forest, but I never went camping there again. Luckily for me, it was a memorable camping trip. Train to hell. Rai, he had once been a professional thief. No matter where he was, he could carry out his actions smoothly. That day, the location was the subway, and it was also where he would pay a heavy price for his sins. While fleeing from pursuit, Rai boarded a subway train that looked quite old, carrying the scent of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly metallic, almost like the smell of blood. The subway car was nearly empty, except for a few scattered passengers in various cars. Most of them seemed lost in their own worlds. One was dozing off, another absorbed in their phone. But then, at the far end of the car, there was an older man who looked quite terrifying. He wore a long, dark coat, his face obscured by shadows, but his eyes were cold and piercing, chillingly sharp. Rai tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat, looking elsewhere. But the feeling of always being watched made him very alert. The subway suddenly jolted, the lights flickering more violently before dimming to a weak, pale yellow. The train began to slow down, the sound of the brakes screeching like a high-pitched wail echoing through the thief's skull. He glanced around, noticing that the other passengers had disappeared, leaving only him and the mysterious man at the end of the car. He tried to stand up, move toward the exit, but his legs were stiff. The man in the dark coat began to stand up, moving toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his eyes never leaving the thief. The subway train came to a complete stop. The doors remained closed. The thief was trapped. The man approached the thief, raising one hand with fingers unusually long and thin, and waved it slowly in front of the thief's face. The thief's eyes glazed over, his mind succumbing to the invisible power of hypnosis. His body went limp, collapsing into the seat as he was pulled into a vision, deeper and deeper, until the subway car completely vanished. Rye found himself standing in a nightmarish version of a subway station. The walls were cracked and oozing a thick black substance, the lights flickering. The tracks were covered in a dense, glowing red fog that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The thief staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he looked around, trying to find a way out. But the exits were blocked, sealed shut by heavy iron gates covered in chains and padlocks that had mysteriously appeared. A moment later, he suddenly saw a reflection in the glass, a reflection of himself, but with his coat tattered and scorched, his face pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes, his lips twisted into a grotesque, terrifying smile. Scenes of his past crimes played out before him, distorted and twisted into horrific images of suffering and despair. In one scene, he watched himself pickpocketing a man on the subway, but this time, the man turned to him, his face melting away to reveal a skull with eyes burning with fire. The skeletal figure grabbed the thief's wrist, pulling him into the darkness where the sound of screams echoed. Next, another vision unfolded. Rye broke into an apartment, and suddenly, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell into a pit filled with writhing hands, clawing at his flesh as they dragged him down, as if pulling him into hell. The images kept coming, each more horrifying than the last. Each vision was a punishment for the sins he had committed. He saw himself as one of the damned, trapped forever on this hellish train, riding the tracks of torment for all eternity. Inside the train, the thief was surrounded by the ghosts of his past victims. Their eyes burned with the fire of hatred. In his own eyes, the furnace roared with life, the flames growing hotter until they consumed everything. The thief was left in total darkness. The thief snapped back to reality, gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. He was back in the subway car. The man in the dark coat was gone, leaving only the sound of the train clattering on the tracks. Shaking, the thief staggered to his feet and exited the train. As he stepped onto the platform, he glanced back at the subway car. The train pulled away, the sound of its departure echoing through the empty station. The thief stood alone, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Now he knew that there was no escaping the consequences, the punishment for his actions. Since that day, he has lived in darkness, plagued by agonizing headaches that feel like torture. He must live in fear, haunted by what he had seen and experienced. Perhaps this is just one of the punishments he has to endure. The hitchhiker's nightmare. The chilly spring air bit at my skin. It was a quiet night as I left the subway restaurant. The shopping mall where the subway was located was desolate, except for a few dim streetlights casting pale circles of light over the empty parking lot. Though the place was somewhat old and empty, the quality was decent, and it was only a 5 to 10 minute drive from my house. As I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man walking past the stores. He was tall, disheveled, wearing sweatpants and a dingy t-shirt. As he passed by the window, he glanced at me. It was only a brief look, but something about him left me feeling uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Just some guy. I pushed open the door, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking the short distance to my car. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, they were faint, but they quickly grew louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, the man from earlier. He was walking toward me, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. I stopped, unsure of what he wanted. He was too close for comfort. He asked me for a ride to the gas station just down the street. His voice was calm, almost friendly, as he pointed toward a gas station nearby, visible from where we stood. It didn't seem far, and it was on my way home. Though I hesitated, the cold air and his seemingly urgent demeanor convinced me to agree. I got into my car, and the man sat in the passenger seat. I drove out of the parking lot, down the empty streets, making the short drive to the gas station. Neither of us said a word. The entire time, something felt off about the situation. I kept telling myself everything was fine, it was just a quick ride, after all. When we arrived at the gas station, I parked in the back of the lot. I expected him to get out right away, but he didn't. Seconds passed in uncomfortable silence, and my anxiety grew. I said, "All right, we're here," trying to sound casual, hoping he would leave, but he didn't move. The man stared straight ahead, making no move to get out of the car. My heart started pounding as I repeated myself, this time more firmly. "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" Finally, he spoke. His tone had changed. It was no longer friendly, but cold, almost irritated. He told me this wasn't the right gas station, and that he needed to go to a different one farther away. I glanced at the gas station in front of us, confused and worried. I was sure this was the place he pointed to. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I told him I wasn't going any farther and that I needed to go home. The man didn't reply. He just sat there, silent. The tension in the car was building, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I asked him to get out, my voice now shaky. He refused and said no. I glanced around the gas station, looking for someone who might help. A few cars were parked under the bright lights, but I didn't dare move. He seemed stubborn, and I was scared he might harm me. I felt trapped, like the walls of the car were closing in on me. Suddenly, a noise broke the tension, a car door slamming nearby. I glanced into the rearview mirror and saw a woman stepping out of her car, walking toward the gas station store. Seeing someone else, even from a distance, gave me a brief surge of courage. I turned back to him, my voice stronger this time. "I need you to get out of my car, right now." His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned slightly toward me. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said he wouldn't get out until I took him where he needed to go. I couldn't take him anywhere else, and I couldn't sit there any longer with the fear gnawing at me. I glanced back at the gas station, hoping someone would look my way, but no one did. I needed an exit, and fast. I reached for my phone, trying to act as casual as possible. I said, "Okay," to buy myself some time, pretending to check the GPS for the other gas station he claimed he wanted to go to. He said nothing, but his eyes never left me. As my hand fumbled for the phone in my pocket, I could feel his gaze, watching my every move. My heart raced as I unlocked my phone, pretending to look up directions. In reality, I was opening the keypad. My mind raced, calculating how quickly I could call for help without him noticing. But before I could act, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my wrist. Panic exploded in my chest. He squeezed my wrist painfully as he leaned closer, his face just inches from mine. I tried to pull away, but he held me tight. His voice was cold, threatening, telling me not to even think about it. I froze. My breath became shallow as I tried to stay calm and think of a way out. The gas station lights cast harsh shadows on his face, making him look even more terrifying. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a police car pulling into the gas station, its headlights sweeping over the parking lot. The other man must have seen it too, because his hand suddenly loosened my wrist. Without warning, he let go of my wrist, opened the door, and got out of the car. He didn't look back, just walked quickly into the darkness behind the gas station. For a few minutes, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. My wrist throbbed where he had grabbed me, but I was too shaken to focus on the pain. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I started the engine. I didn't want to stay there any longer. Without looking back, I drove out of the parking lot and onto the road, my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, my mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail etched into my memory. What did he want? What would have happened if the police hadn't shown up? One thing was certain, I would never make the mistake of letting a stranger into my car again. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat in the silence of my car for a long time, staring out at the empty street. The weight of what had just happened settled over me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to fully feel the fear. After resting for a bit, I was scrolling through the web to calm my nerves when I stumbled upon Complaint and wanted reports about a man who looked exactly like the one I had encountered. He was known for tricking people into giving him rides, then using various methods to steal something. He wanted after following his victims. Using the phone number I found in the article, I immediately reported to the local police where I last saw him, right that same night. Thank God, I realized how lucky I was to have escaped that mysterious man and survived. Lucky that the police had been there. Lucky that I hadn't driven him farther and made it home safely. Nightmare House on the Hillside. I was 6 or 7 years old when my parents divorced. My younger sister had just been born. My mother and stepfather decided to move into a new house, thinking it would be a fresh start for all of us, but it didn't turn out that way. It was an old house in the suburbs, built in the mid-1800s. It had 2 stories and a basement below. Down there was a door that led to water tanks used to heat the house, locked tight, with only my mom and the landlord having the key. We were warned not to go near it. I didn't understand why, but my room was always colder than the other rooms, even though it was right above the basement. I often heard strange creaking sounds, like someone walking on the floorboards. The house was quite old, and I would often see wasps coming from the attic. They swarmed as if drawn to something. I wasn't the only one who experienced strange things. My mom and stepfather often heard footsteps in the living room late at night, pacing back and forth, never stopping. But they brushed it off and said it was nothing. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like someone was in the room with me. I turned over and saw a boy, his face obscured by shadows, wearing old-fashioned clothes, about my age, standing near my desk. I sat up in bed. He asked me if I wanted to play with his toys. I told him no, it was too late, and I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents. Then his expression changed, becoming angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished from my cold room. I ran to tell my mom, but she reassured me it was just a dream. Still, I knew she didn't believe it either. I began to feel something was wrong with this house. The next night, it happened again. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She was standing on my bed. She stood hunched over, her tangled hair hanging down over my face. She stared at me with deep, hollow eyes that were completely black, her breath chilling as it hit my face. I jumped up, flung open the door, and ran to my sister's room. She was still asleep in her crib. I looked back at the door and saw the woman slowly walking toward me. As she passed the window, lightning struck outside, and in that moment, the woman disappeared. With each flash of lightning, she would reappear, getting closer to me. I woke up again, back in my bed, drenched in sweat. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? But it felt too real. I ran to my mom and stepfather, telling them everything. Their faces went pale as I spoke, but but they told me it was just a nightmare. It was a lie they had been telling me ever since we moved into that house. A few days later, we moved out. My mother didn't say why, but I could tell by the way she hurried us out of the house that something had scared her too. It wasn't until many years later that she told me. The landlord eventually confessed what had happened in the house long ago. During the Civil War, a widowed mother and her 3 children lived there. After her husband was killed in battle, the woman's mind shattered. You ever or roll? In a fit of madness, she killed the rest of her family in the living room before dragging their bodies down to the water tank room in the basement. These things explained what I had experienced in that house, from the moved items to my toys being displaced. The boy I saw was one of her children, still trapped in the house, either searching for companionship or perhaps seeking revenge. And the woman, the one who stood over my bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horrors she had endured. I often wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in that house. Would we have become part of their story? Would that woman have done to us what she had done to her own children? I will never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still think about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held. Stranger at the campsite. A woman, Lena, in her 20s, stood at the edge of the familiar trail leading to her campsite. Her hiking backpack was slung over her shoulders, and a neatly rolled up tent was strapped to it. She breathed in the fresh air, savoring the tranquility of nature. Lena had been camping here for years, escaping the monotony of her small town. The forest was her refuge. Lena moved forward, following the trail leading to the lake. The setting sun filtered through the trees. She felt at home here, but today, a strange unease crept into her chest. As Lena rounded the corner and arrived at the clearing by the lake, her heart skipped a beat. Standing near the water's edge was a man. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing regular swim trunks and a faded white t-shirt. His small tent was already set up, not far from where hers would be. He was staring out across the lake, his back turned to her. Lena hesitated for a moment. She usually camped alone, and seeing someone else here made her feel uneasy. With a slight shrug, she moved a little further from his tent and began setting up her own. She gathered large stones, arranging them into a neat circle to prepare for her campfire later. As she was absorbed in her work, she noticed movement. The man was no longer facing the lake. He was staring directly at her, standing eerily still. Lena's heart raced. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her campfire. But every time she glanced up, he was still there, motionless, his eyes locked on her. Her discomfort grew. She awkwardly raised her hand and waved. Maybe he was just being polite. Maybe he wanted to say hello. But after a moment of silence, the man simply turned and walked along the shore without acknowledging her. Lena frowned. Something about him didn't feel right, but she shook off the thought. She grabbed a chair and sat by the shore, determined to relax and enjoy the view. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. Lena packed up her chair and returned to her campsite. She started a campfire, hoping to relax after the strange encounter. As she stared into the flames, her eyes drifted toward the tree line. A figure stood in the distance, partially hidden behind a tree. Lena squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It was the man in the white shirt. He had returned, standing there, watching from a distance. Lena quickly shifted her chair to the other side of the fire so she could face him. Time passed slowly. The man stood frozen in place as the forest around them grew darker. The shadows deepened, and soon, his figure became blurry, blending into the trees. Even though it was dark, Lena knew he was still there. He could see her clearly, illuminated by the fire, but she could no longer see him. Fear gnawed at her. What was he doing? Why hadn't he returned to his tent? Hours passed, and Lena remained tense, staring into the trees. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and distant crickets. She considered leaving but feared the man might follow her, keeping her rooted in place. She stoked the fire, ensuring it burned brightly, knowing it was her only way to keep the surrounding darkness at bay. Lena sat by the campfire, her face blurred in the flickering firelight. The night was already thick with shadows. The forest around her was a pitch-black void. Her eyes continuously turned to the tree line where the man stood. Even though she could no longer see him, she knew he was still out there, following, waiting. Suddenly, a tree branch broke nearby. Lena stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her camp, squinting into the darkness. Perhaps he has already arrived. The flames cast long, flickering shadows. Lena couldn't stop imagining shapes moving among the trees. There, at the edge of the tree line, someone was probably standing there because she always heard footsteps crunching through the forest. Then slowly, the man's silhouette appeared. She regained her determination, suddenly stood up, picked up a thick branch from the fire, and held it as a weapon. The man didn't flinch. He remained still, watching her as if waiting for her next move. Lena shouted into the darkness, her voice trembling but firm, asking who he was and what he wanted from her, but there was no response. The man tilted his head slightly, as if confused by her defiance. Lena's skin prickled with fear. She gripped the burning branch tightly and stepped closer to the edge of the campfire, ready to defend herself. But then, without warning, the man turned and walked into the forest. Slowly, cautiously. His footsteps were eerily soft. Lena watched him go, not daring to follow. He disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the trees, but the tension in the air didn't lessen. She didn't believe he was truly gone. The night dragged on. Lena struggled to stay alert, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind clouded with fear. The fire had burned down, casting only a faint light. Despite her best efforts, her eyes began to droop. She couldn't fight it any longer. After only a short while, Lena was startled awake by a faint sound, her eyes snapping open. The fire was nearly out. Only a few embers remained. The air was cold and damp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure if she had imagined the sound. But then she heard the faint rustling sound again, this time coming from behind the tent. Lena's heart raced. She stood up slowly, creeping carefully to avoid making any noise. She grabbed a nearly burnt-out branch from the fire, gripping it tightly. She cautiously walked around the tent, following the sound. The rustling grew louder as she approached the back of the tent. Lena tightened her grip on the branch. She took a deep breath and rounded the tent, only to find a squirrel nibbling away. The area behind the tent was empty. Lena frowned, confused. She could have sworn she heard something like footsteps. She returned to the fire, scanning the surroundings. The first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. Lena's body was stiff from sitting for hours, her eyes heavy from the sleepless night. It seemed like she was very lucky. For some reason, the man never returned, and she saw no sign of him for hours. But the insecurity is still there. Lena quickly packed her things, wasting no time. She glanced nervously at the tree line. The forest remained quiet and still, as if the events of the previous night had never happened, and she wished that were true. She slung her backpack over her shoulders and began walking briskly toward her car. Her legs trembled. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made her jump, but the trail remained empty. As Lena neared the parking lot, she began to feel a sense of relief. She could see her car up ahead, the only vehicle in sight. She quickened her pace, eager to leave the forest and the strange man behind. But as she reached the clearing, she froze in her tracks. His tent was still there. She slowly, cautiously, walked toward it. The tent flap was slightly open, the inside dark, but there was nothing there. Lena backed away, her mind racing. What kind of game was this? Was he even real? She snapped out of it and hurried toward her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she started the engine, and drove off. As Lena sped down the winding road, she glanced into her rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, partially hidden by the trees, was the man in the white shirt. His hand was raised, thumb out, as if hitchhiking. Lena pressed the gas pedal harder, her car speeding away, and she never looked back or returned to that forest again. It left her with an unforgettable memory, perhaps the worst camping trip she'd ever had. The house of the lost child. It was 2006 when my family moved into this house. My parents decided to quit their jobs and start anew in the countryside. I was just a child then. But something about this house struck me immediately. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was the stairs. Every time I passed by, I would see a shadow silently moving up and down. It never frightened me. In fact, it felt oddly familiar. I was 6 years old, but I could always see things that others couldn't, and this house was no exception. I didn't tell my parents right away, not because I was scared, but because I felt that presence meant us no harm. Still, I was very afraid of the dark. My room was upstairs while the bathroom was downstairs. Every night, before going to bed, I would use the bathroom to avoid facing the fear of going down the stairs alone at night. But one night, my mother's voice woke me. She called out to me, angrily and irritably, telling me to come downstairs and not to run around anymore. I sat up in bed, confused. I hadn't run at all. In the following days, I kept experiencing similar incidents. My mother often scolded me for running around the house, accusing me of mischief. I had told her many times that I hadn't done it, but she never believed me. Then one night, the power went out, and we were almost engulfed in darkness, lit only by a few flickering candles in the living room. As we sat together, I saw it again, a shadow. It swayed back and forth, hovering over the sofa. My mother didn't see it, but I did. That presence was very strong but had no malice. That night, as we lay in bed, my mother and I heard a voice, soft yet clear as day. "Mom, where are you? I'm cold." That voice belonged to a child, and it came from just outside our bedroom. My mother looked at me, eyes wide with fear. As I grew older, I began to understand that the shadow wasn't there to harm us. It wasn't a ghost trying to scare us, but a lost child searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that spirit was looking for its mother. I had a friend who could sense things like I could, and they suggested that I tell the spirit to move on. So one quiet afternoon, I stood in the living room and said to the air, "I believe your mother loves you very much. You can move on. It's time to go to a happier place." The house felt different afterward. The shadow disappeared. The footsteps stopped. No more voices at night. I thought that the spirit had finally found peace, or perhaps it needed to validate something because it had been left here and unable to move on in this house. In 2018, my aunt, Tita, who had worked abroad, returned home to retire. One evening, we sat together in the living room, sharing stories. We talked about the strange occurrences that had taken place in the house over the years. I told her about that spirit, about how my mother had once mistaken it for me because it looked like a small child. I explained how I had ultimately helped it move on. As I was speaking, I noticed something. Tita, she's crying. She started telling me a story I had never heard before. Long before I was born, my grandmother, she was pregnant with Aunt Tita. Not long after that, there was a baby boy. She named her son Angelo. Suddenly, one day, Grandma left and didn't come back. At that time, Aunt and Angelo were too young to know what to do in this remote suburb. So, Angelo lay on the sofa. The boy was sick and passed away in his sleep while clutching a small glass jar that his mother had given him. He was only about 3 to 4 years old. At that time, my aunt was too young to understand what was happening and thought her brother was just sleeping until one day a neighbor came and took the boy to a small coffin and buried him. Our new house sits on this land. Perhaps the boy could not move on because he was waiting and didn't know when his mother would return. Sometime later, my aunt, the boy's sister, passed away just after we talked about him. Now, standing in front of the house, I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. Then came the unmistakable sound of soft footsteps. They echoed from the hallway behind me, moving toward the stairs. I turned around, breath caught in my throat. The shadow had returned. As I climbed the stairs, I saw the shadow standing right above and sliding into my bedroom. Upon reaching the room, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, and just as I was about to turn it, I heard, "Mom, where are you?" I slowly pushed the door open, the creaking hinges filling the silent house. The room was bathed in the faint light of the moon filtering through the window, casting a cold glow over everything. My heart skipped a beat as I saw Angelo. This time, he was not just a shadow. He stood in the middle of the room, a small, frail figure, unmistakably a child. His head was bowed down. Then slowly, Angelo lifted his head, and for the first time, I saw his face. A face with deep-set eyes filled with sorrow. His mouth opened, and in a voice that sent chills down my spine, he whispered, "Mom, where is she?" I wanted to tell him, to explain that she had passed away. But before I could say anything, he raised a small glass jar, looking at it as if it held an ominous energy imprisoning his soul. Angelo stood still, clutching the jar, looking at me with hollow eyes. I had to do something. I couldn't let Angelo remain trapped forever. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling as I finally spoke to Angelo, telling him that his mother was no longer here. I told him to always believe that she loved him, so I urged him to move on. For a moment, Angelo's expression softened, but then he tightened his grip on the jar. His voice rang out again, firm and more desperate. "Where is my mom? I want to see her." As if he didn't believe the words I was saying. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized there were no words that could satisfy him. He wasn't just seeking peace. He wanted his mother, and nothing else mattered more than that. I could feel the air shift, the temperature drop, and for the first time in years, I felt fear. I couldn't let him stay. I had to help him find peace. Without thinking, I stepped toward him, my hands trembling. "Angelo, I can help you find her. But first, you need to let go, to release everything." His gaze shifted from the jar to me, his hollow eyes filled with confusion and longing. Slowly, very slowly, he began to loosen his grip on the jar. As it fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the room went silent. Angelo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the moonlight. Before he disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, soft, almost a whisper. "Thank you." I stood outside the house. The weight that had burdened it for years was gone. Angelo was finally free. The feeling of guilt lingered, but I knew I had finally helped him find the peace he had been searching for all these years. The love his mother had for him, the love that had anchored Angelo to this world, had freed him. Perhaps he was beginning to understand the painful truths that even I never wanted to hear. He would likely continue his journey to find his mother in another world where he truly belonged. I looked back at the house one last time. It no longer felt haunted. Now, it was just a house, quiet and still. Angelo had gone, But he left behind something much more enduring. It was a son's love for his mother, transcending the boundaries of life and death. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop," I yelled. But my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train, But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet. But that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. "Stop." Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting, like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me. Slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking. and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. The cruise ship in room 105. 2 years ago, after days of hard work, I treated myself to a vacation. I had booked my holiday on a cruise ship, and my room was in cabin 105. I was informed that my cabin had bunk beds, so I would have to share the cabin with someone else. It was a bit inconvenient, but I thought it wouldn't be a problem. When I arrived, his belongings were there, a suitcase and a few clothes scattered around, but I didn't see him anywhere. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the cabin was a musty smell in the air. The room was cold, abnormally cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But I brushed it aside, thinking it was just the sea air coming in through the vents. That night, I fell asleep in the bottom bunk, exhausted from the day's activities. I expected my roommate to return at any moment, but as I drifted off, the cabin remained quiet. At some point after midnight, I was jolted awake by a gentle noise from above. The top bunk creaked as if someone was shifting, and I assumed my roommate had finally returned and gone to bed. But then, I heard the noise again, a metallic clink. My eyes flew open. It was too dark to see anything, but I could hear footsteps moving toward the cabin door. A moment later, suddenly the door creaked open slowly, and I heard footsteps running down the hallway. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Had my roommate come in and left without saying a word? The door remained ajar, gently swaying as the ship rocked with the waves. I got out of bed, walked over, and closed the door, the cold draft from the hallway sending chills down my spine. I looked up at the top bunk, the curtain drawn. The figure I had heard was gone, but there was something unsettling about the way the curtain hung, almost as if someone or something was still there, hiding behind it. When I woke up the next morning, the ship was gently swaying on the waves, but the cabin was freezing. The window was wide open, and the musty smell was worse than ever. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn, and my roommate was nowhere to be found. I hadn't heard a single sound or voice from him. I decided to talk to a staff member about the discomfort of the cabin. His name was Nicky. I began explaining the cold, the foul smell, and the strange occurrences from the night. He listened, but as soon as I mentioned cabin 105, his expression changed. He asked me with a pale face if I was in cabin 105. I answered, confused by his reaction, and asked what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. Then, in a low voice, leaning in and whispering, "There's something wrong with that cabin. Every passenger who's ever stayed there has disappeared. They all fell overboard. No one knows why. We're not allowed to talk about it. They say it's cursed." Having said that, he quickly left, leaving me standing there, stunned in shock. That night, I returned to the cabin, trying to suppress my fear. The curtain on the top bunk was still drawn tight, and the air was colder than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I hadn't seen my roommate since I arrived. I decided to pull the curtain back to see for myself. My hands trembled as I reached for the curtain. I slowly pulled it back, hoping to find nothing. And indeed, there was nothing there, just an empty bed. The smell of the sea was now stronger, pungent and overwhelming. I could almost taste the salt on my tongue. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The room plunged into darkness as the flickering lights finally went out. My heart raced in my chest, and I heard it again, the sound. It was the sound of gentle footsteps again, but this time, they didn't come from the hallway. They came from the top bunk. I turned around just as I heard the creak that seemed to echo throughout the room. My blood ran cold. I could barely make out the shape of something moving beneath the blanket on the top bunk, writhing like a mass, and I could see the blanket suddenly swell oddly as if something was growing underneath it. I stepped back in fear as a pale, dripping hand slid out from beneath the blanket. It wasn't a human hand. It was swollen, grayish, the fingers puffy and twisted. The smell of rotting seaweed filled the air. I screamed, bolting out of the cabin, not stopping until I reached the deck. The cold night air hit me, and I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But when I looked up, the sight before me left me breathless. There, on the deck, was the shadow of a man. His body was pale and bloated, his clothes tattered and soaked. His hollow eyes stared at me, empty and soulless. I ran to one of the ship's staff, desperate to tell him what had happened. He listened, his expression serious, as he quietly said, "Cabin 105. I've heard the stories, but no one has ever seen what you have." He suggested that after his shift, he would come to the room with me to prove there was a reasonable explanation. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. The ship was full, and there was nowhere else for me to stay. He and I sat in the cabin, the door locked. We searched the room from top to bottom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We had a glass of whiskey, trying to ease my tension. He began to tell me that the first time this happened was a month ago. The man in that cabin had issues. He had escaped from a mental hospital and booked a ticket for this cruise. They said he jumped overboard to end it all. But every passenger since then has seen something. Just then, as Nicky spoke, the window latch began to slowly turn, as if someone were on the other side. His face paled as the window opened on its own. The smell of the sea flooded the room, and the lights flickered once more. Something moved on the top bunk. Nicky stood up, eyes wide in fear at something on the bed. I turned around, my heart pounding. There, on the top bunk, was the figure of a pale, bloated man, soaked in seawater. His lifeless eyes stared down at us as he reached out his hand. Nicky rushed toward the door, but it was too late. The figure leaped off the bed, its cold, wet hands wrapping around his throat. He screamed, trying to break free, but it was too strong. It tightened, choking the life out of him. I grabbed the cross around my neck and held it up. It let out a scream of terror and released him, turning its deadly white eyes towards me. With one last desperate push, I flung the door open, and the figure rushed through, disappearing into the dark hallway. The figure seemed to dissolve into the night, its body sinking into the dark waters below. We stood on the deck, gasping for breath, the horror of what just happened sinking in. By morning, after witnessing everything, they had sealed off cabin 105. No one was allowed inside anymore. The ship continued its journey, but the horror lingered. Cabin 105 was cursed, and whatever haunted it would never truly disappear.